After 32 years with the Arizona Game and Fish Department, Steve Gallizioli retired as head of its Wildlife Management Division in 1983. When I spoke with Gallizioli in September 2004, I asked him about his experiences with holistic resource management and whether he knew its developer, Allan Savory.
Yeah, I did. I even went over to Albuquerque and spent a week taking one of Allan Savory's courses. At that time, it was when the word was going around that Steve Gallizioli was really mad at the ranchers. In fact, I wound up getting the nickname Grazioli. And Allan Savory heard about me, and like he's done to a few other people, including Steve Johnson. I know Steve Johnson was offered a free tuition over there. I think he went over, just like I was offered a free tuition, and I still had to pay my other expenses, but Game and Fish paid for that. I took the course, and before I went over there, I had heard Allan Savory speak on his, at that time it was called the Savory Grazing Method, and then it became Holistic Resource Management shortly thereafter. And I knew he was a fantastic speaker, and he had, he had the kind of charisma that allow him to sell ice boxes to Eskimos in the middle of winter. And I knew going in that I was going to have to watch myself to not be brainwashed. And he brainwashed me anyway. To such an extent that when I came back, I even wrote a letter and sent it to a number of people that knew about how I felt about grazing, and said, I think I found a solution, because one of my concerns at that point was that can we ever possibly get together with the livestock people and reconcile our differences, so that we can have both the livestock and wildlife without one impacting on the other. And I had about concluded that it's impossible. It's never going to happen for a number of reasons, some of which I've discussed already to you. And then here comes a guy that proceeds to demonstrate how you can actually have better wildlife habitat with livestock on the range. And I bought it for a while. In fact, I even gave a talk at a meeting of the Arizona Cattlemen's Association up at Prescott, where I stuck my neck out and said, I think this is something that all ranchers ought to be considering. I think it's the way to go. It's the way to get away from this fight between ranchers and environmentalists. And then I sat back and I waited to see if anything was going to happen, and when anything changed my mind. And before long, I realized that he'd been preaching this for quite a while in Arizona and preaching it elsewhere, and he came from Rhodesia, or what is now Zimbabwe, and had developed this thing over there. And back in 1987, I went to Africa for 7 weeks. I went to Kenya and Tanzania, and down to southern Africa into South Africa and Botswana, and got up to Zimbabwe for several days. A friend of mine from New York came with me. And before I went over, I called Allan Savory, and I told him what I was going to do, and I was planning on going into Zimbabwe, and I liked the name of a couple of ranchers that had been practicing holistic resource management, so I can see how good the habitat was after being subject to that kind of management for a long time. And much to my surprise, he said, you know, after I left there, those people just gave it up. I said, what? You're preaching that this is an easy system to implement and that it's going to do all these wonderful things for the rancher, for the range, and for wildlife, and now you're telling me that the people involved in it weren't impressed enough to stay with it when you weren't there to hammer on them? He said, well, I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. Well, that did it. I figured that this has got to be just nothing but a bunch of bullshit. And I continued to correspond with him for a while and ask him questions that he couldn't answer. And one time I and several forest people from the Tonto National Forest hiked up to a place called Dutch Woman Butte. It's an area that had never been grazed. And I dragged my sorry carcass up to that place. That was the roughest climb I ever made. And I was amazed. Here was a place that had never been grazed because it was just too hard for the cattle to get up there. And there were very few deer. I found several deer tracks and a couple of javelina tracks. And I forget how many different species of perennial grasses we counted. I think it was something like 19 or 29. And this is in Tonto Basin, where off of this butte, the cattle had just completely destroyed the habitat. And if you read this report from the Forest Service, you'll read what Tonto Basin was like at one time. And it must have been a fantastic place. And now, instead of, and they talk about the grass used to be so high on these mesas that they used to go in and cut it for winter hay. You look at these mesas now, and there's nothing but scrubby mesquite, catclaw, and prickly pear, and if you can find a perennial grass, you're doing damn good. And yet, up about 1,000 feet higher than the bottom of we had all these fantastic grasses. And it's not that if you get to that elevation off of Dutch Woman Butte that you find these same species, because you don't. And I took a bunch of pictures, and I sent half a dozen of them to Allan Savory, and I told him, this is an area that's never been grazed by livestock. Never. The cattle can't get up there. There's practically no large animal up there. A couple of deer tracks and a couple of javelina tracks, about all I could find. He said, oh no, there must be a big deer herd up there for that kind of a situation to develop. Talking about the grasses that I showed in the picture. He as much as told me I was lying, and I said, I felt like really telling him what I thought about him at that point, but I didn't.